The desert air shimmered like broken glass across the tarmac at Bagram Airfield, Afghanistan. It was 5:47 hours when Captain Nora Kerrigan walked toward the flight line, her boots making no sound against the cracked concrete. She moved with the deliberate pace of someone who had learned long ago that rushing meant mistakes, and mistakes at 30,000 feet meant body bags. The other pilots called her relic behind her back. At 42, she was ancient by fighter pilot standards, a rarity in a profession that chewed up bodies and spit out statistics. Her face carried the weight of 17 years in service, 3 deployments, and a distinguished flying cross she never wore. The younger pilots, fresh from Pensacola with their perfect vision and faster reflexes, watched her with barely concealed contempt. They whispered that she should be teaching at some safety school, not strapping into an A-10 Thunderbolt II for close air support missions over hostile territory. But command kept her flying, and nobody quite understood why. There were rumors, of course. Some said she had political connections. Others claimed she had dirt on a general. The truth was buried in classified files that nobody bothered to read anymore. What mattered was that when the tasking order came down that morning, her name was on it. Single ship reconnaissance along the Kunar River Valley. Grid coordinates that made the intelligence officer's hand shake when he marked them on the map. The mission brief had been terse. Radio chatter indicated Taliban movement near a village called Gashta, population 200, strategic value 0. Except strategic value was never really 0 when Americans were bleeding. 3 platoons from the 173rd Airborne had gone dark 6 hours earlier. Their last transmission was garbled, cut short by what sounded like automatic weapons fire. Command needed eyes in the valley before they sent helicopters into what might be an ambush. Kerrigan signed the roster without comment. The operations officer, a major young enough to be her son, studied her with obvious doubt. "You sure about this, Captain? That's rough terrain. The thermals coming off those ridges this time of morning can flip an aircraft." She met his gaze with eyes the color of winter storms. "I've been flying since you were in middle school, sir." He didn't argue. Nobody ever did, not directly. They just assigned her the missions nobody else wanted and waited for her to prove them right about her age, her reflexes, her obsolescence. The A-10 Thunderbolt II sat on the hardstand like a forgotten monument to uglier wars. It was not beautiful. It was not fast. The airframe dated back to the Cold War, designed to kill Soviet tanks in European fields that never saw the battle everyone expected. Twin turbofan engines mounted high on the fuselage, straight wings built for low-altitude loitering, and a titanium bathtub surrounding the cockpit that could take hits from anything short of a surface-to-air missile. The nose housed the GAU-8 Avenger, a 30mm rotary cannon that could fire 65 rounds per second. The aircraft was built around the gun, not the other way around. Everything else was just there to get the gun to the fight. Kerrigan performed her walk-around in silence. She checked the landing gear struts, the weapons pylons, the chaff and flare dispensers. Her crew chief, Staff Sergeant Makna Lopez, watched from beside the ladder. Lopez was one of the few people on base who didn't treat Kerrigan like a museum exhibit. They had flown together on her last deployment to Iraq, back when Mosul was still burning. "She's ready, ma'am," Lopez said. "Full combat load. 2,500 rounds for the gun, 4 Mavericks, 2 rocket pods, topped off the fuel 30 minutes ago." Kerrigan nodded. She ran her hand along the fuselage, feeling the rivets beneath her palm. The aircraft's nose arch showed a faded image of a raven perched on a lightning bolt, nearly worn away by sandstorms and sun. Someone had painted it years ago, probably before half the current squadron was born. "You good, ma'am?" Lopez asked quietly. "Always am." "They're talking again, in the ready room." Kerrigan pulled on her helmet, securing the chin strap with practiced efficiency. "They're always talking, Lopez. That's what people do when they're scared." "They ain't scared of the mission. They're scared you'll make them look bad." For the first time that morning, Something that might have been a smile touched Kerrigan's mouth. Then they should fly better. She climbed the ladder and settled into the cockpit. The seat wrapped around her like an old jacket, every switch and dial exactly where her hands expected them to be. She had logged over 3,000 hours in the A-10, more than any other pilot currently in theater. She knew the aircraft's sounds, its vibrations, the way it pulled left under heavy G-loads because of a manufacturing defect that nobody had ever bothered to fix. The engine start sequence was second nature. Right engine first, listening to the turbine wind up from a whisper to a howl, then the left. The whole airframe shuddered as power fed through the systems. Hydraulics came online. Flight controls checked. Weapons systems armed. She tested the stick, feeling the ailerons and elevators respond through the feedback. Everything moved smooth. Everything felt right. Tower cleared her for taxi at 6:12. She released the brakes and let the A-10 roll forward, following the taxiway toward runway 27. The sun was climbing now, turning the mountains to the east into jagged shadows against a copper sky. Somewhere beyond those peaks, soldiers were waiting, maybe alive, maybe not. Her job was to find them before the Taliban finished whatever they had started. The radio crackled. Hog 2-1 tower, you're cleared for immediate takeoff. Winds 280 at 12 knots. Altimeter 3012. Contact departure on button 4. 2-1 copies, Kerrigan replied. Her voice was flat, professional, carrying none of the emotion that civilians expected from people about to fly into combat. Emotion got you killed. Emotion made you hesitate. She lined up on the center line and pushed the throttles forward. They accelerated with the enthusiasm of a freight train, sluggish and inevitable. It was not a fighter. It did not leap into the sky. It clawed its way up through sheer stubborn persistence. 80 knots, 100, 120. She pulled back on the stick and felt the nose wheel leave the ground, then the mains. The aircraft climbed away from Bagram, banking northeast toward the mountains. Below her, the base shrank to a collection of tan buildings and parked vehicles. The perimeter walls looked like pencil lines drawn across the desert. She climbed through 3,000 feet, then 5,000, heading for the high ground where the air was thinner and the thermals less violent. The cockpit smelled like jet fuel and sun-baked plastic. Sweat already beaded on her forehead beneath the helmet. Bagram departure. Hog 2-1 is airborne, climbing to Angels 15. Roger 2-1, radar contact. Proceed on course. No traffic. Contact Gunslinger on 253.4 when crossing the ridge. She acknowledged and switched frequencies. The flight plan took her north along the Kunar River Valley, following terrain that rose from 2,000 feet to over 12,000 in less than 20 miles. It was unforgiving country, all vertical rock and narrow canyons where the wind did things that violated physics. The intelligence brief had been thin, almost insultingly so. Taliban fighters, number unknown, had engaged American forces near Gashta sometime after midnight. The fighting had been intense enough to wake locals 3 valleys away. Radio intercepts suggested the insurgents had heavy machine guns, possibly mortars. What they definitely had was high ground and patience. The kind of patience that came from fighting in these mountains for generations. Kerrigan leveled off at 15,000 feet and trimmed the aircraft. From here, the world below looked peaceful. Ridiculous, really. Rivers carved silver lines through green valleys. Villages appeared as clusters of brown squares. The scale made violence seem impossible, but she had been doing this long enough to know that appearances were the first casualty of war. She checked her tactical display. The coordinates for Gashta glowed amber on the screen, still 30 miles northeast. She adjusted her heading slightly, compensating for the wind that always blew down from the peaks. The A-10's engines hummed at cruise power, a sound so familiar it might as well have been her own heartbeat. Gunslinger, Hog 2-1 checking in, Angels 15, 20 minutes from target area. The voice that answered belonged to the tactical air control party embedded with the ground forces. He sounded tired. Hog 2-1, Gunslinger. Good to have you overhead. We've got troops in contact, danger close situation. Need immediate reconnaissance of grid Papa Delta 347219. Multiple reports of enemy personnel in the open. Kerrigan copied the grid and punched it into her navigation system. The coordinates sat on the eastern slope of a ridgeline, exactly the kind of place where ambushes happened. Gunslinger 2-1. Understand danger close. Confirm friendlies marked. Affirm. Friendlies are marked with orange panels. They're in a horseshoe position on the west side of the village. Do not, I say again, do not engage anything west of the river. Copy all. She pushed the throttles forward and felt the A-10 accelerate. 15,000 feet was too high for positive identification. She would need to go lower, much lower, into the range where small arms fire could reach her, where one lucky shot could end everything. The mountains rose to meet her, their peaks scraping 10,000 feet. She began her descent, keeping the airspeed high, trading altitude for energy. The thermals hit at 9,000 feet, bouncing the aircraft like a toy. She corrected with small stick movements, keeping the wings level. At 6,000 feet, she crossed the ridgeline and the valley opened before her. The Cunnar River ran swift and brown, swollen with snowmelt from higher elevations. Gashta sat on the eastern bank, maybe 30 buildings clustered around a dirt road. Fields spread in terraces up the hillside, green with wheat. It looked like 1,000 other villages she had seen, unremarkable except for the smoke rising from the northern edge. Her eyes found the orange panels immediately, 3 of them forming a rough triangle in a dried riverbed west of the village. That would be the American position. She counted roughly 20 soldiers, maybe more under cover. They were pinned down, that much was obvious. No movement, probably taking fire from multiple positions. She keyed the radio. Gunslinger 2-1 has eyes on friendlies, searching for targets. Roger 2-1. They're taking effective fire from the village and the ridgeline above. Need you to find those guns. Kerrigan banked the A-10 into a gentle left turn, orbiting at 4,000 feet. She scanned the terrain through the targeting pod's infrared camera. Heat signatures bloomed on the display. Some were animals, some were cooking fires. She needed to separate the living from the fighting. Then she saw it. Muzzle flashes from a rooftop on the village's eastern side. Small caliber, probably AK-47s. Not the heavy guns the intelligence had mentioned, but enough to keep Americans' heads down. She marked the position and kept searching. Movement on the ridgeline. She zoomed the camera and saw figures moving between rocks. They were carrying something long and tubular. A PKM machine gun, Soviet-era, belt-fed. The kind of weapon that could cut a man in half at 500 yards. Gunslinger 2-1. I've got enemy personnel on the eastern ridgeline. Grid Papa Delta 348223. Heavy machine gun. How copy? Solid copy 2-1. Can you engage? Kerrigan checked her altitude and airspeed. She was at 4,000 feet, well within range of small arms fire. The ridgeline was only 800 feet below her. If she rolled in for a gun run, she would be exposed for at least 10 seconds, long enough for anyone with an RPG to take a shot. But that was the job. That was always the job. Affirmed, rolling in. She banked hard right, pulling the aircraft around until the nose pointed at the ridgeline. The targeting reticle centered on the machine gun position. She armed the GAU-8 and felt the aircraft shudder slightly as the gun systems came online. The whole airframe was designed to absorb the recoil of firing what was essentially a flying artillery piece. She pushed the nose down, steepening the dive. The altimeter unwound. 3,500 feet. 3,000. The ridgeline filled her canopy. She could see individual boulders now, the scrub vegetation clinging to the rock. Somewhere down there, men were looking up, tracking her descent, reaching for weapons. 2,500 feet. She put the targeting pipper on the machine gun position and squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 roared. It was not a sound so much as a physical force, a vibration that rattled teeth and blurred vision. The cannon fired 70 rounds in 2 seconds, each projectile the size of a beer bottle. The tracers arced down in a solid stream of orange light. They hit the ridgeline and the earth exploded. Rock and dust fountained into the air. The machine gun position disappeared beneath the impact. Kerrigan pulled out of the dive at 1,800 feet, feeling the G-forces slam her into the seat. The A-10 groaned but held together. It always did. She climbed away from the ridgeline, banking left to avoid flying a predictable pattern. Rule 1 of close air support: never make the same pass twice. Gunslinger 2-1, guns on target. Good hits 2-1, we saw secondaries, that gun is down. She climbed back to 3,000 feet and resumed her orbit. The smoke from her gun run drifted across the hillside, obscuring the target area. She waited for it to clear, searching for movement. The infantry would be repositioning now, using the suppression to advance or withdraw. She needed to keep pressure on the enemy, keep them pinned until the Americans could maneuver. The radio crackled again. Different voice this time, younger, more urgent. Hog 2-1, Gunslinger 6 actual. We've got troops moving to extract our wounded. Need you to watch our 6. Multiple reports of enemy reinforcements from the north. Copy 6, I've got your back. She turned the aircraft north, scanning the approaches to the village. The valley narrowed there, squeezed between steep hillsides that climbed toward snow-covered peaks. It was the only viable route for vehicles. If reinforcements were coming, they would come that way. The targeting pod showed nothing at first. Empty road, abandoned fields. Then she caught it, dust rising from beyond a curve in the valley, vehicles moving fast. She zoomed the camera and counted 3, technical trucks, the kind with machine guns mounted in the beds. They were still 2 miles from the village, but closing quickly. If they reached Gashta, they would hit the American flank. The troops were already pinned down. They could not handle another axis of attack. Gunslinger 6-2-1. I've got 3 vehicles inbound from the north. Grid Papa Delta 345237, 2 miles and closing. Request clearance to engage. There was a pause. She could imagine the calculation happening on the ground. The lieutenant or captain weighing options, checking maps, trying to determine if those trucks were hostile or just civilians who had terrible timing. 2-1 Gunslinger 6, cleared hot, stop those trucks. Kerrigan armed a Maverick missile. The AGM-65 was a fire-and-forget weapon, infrared-guided, designed to kill tanks but perfectly capable of turning a truck into scrap metal. She locked onto the lead vehicle and fired. The missile dropped from the wing pylon and its rocket motor ignited. It streaked away from the aircraft, trailing white smoke, accelerating to nearly supersonic speed. She watched it on the targeting display, a perfect intercept. The missile struck the lead truck and detonated. The vehicle disintegrated in a ball of flame and debris. The other 2 trucks braked hard, skidding on the dirt road. Men jumped from the beds, scattering into the fields. She could see them running, tiny figures trying to escape the aircraft that had just erased their comrades. She fired a second Maverick. The missile hit the second truck before it could reverse. Another explosion, another fireball climbing into the morning sky. The third truck managed to turn around and accelerate back the way it had come. She considered engaging it, but it was already out of effective range and running away from the battlefield. Gunslinger 6-2-1, 3 vehicles engaged, 2 destroyed, 1 retreating north. Road is clear. Outstanding 2-1, you just saved a lot of lives. She did not reply. Saving lives was too complicated a concept for radio communication. She had killed men just now, probably a dozen. They had families. They had reasons for being in those trucks, even if those reasons were terrible. But war did not permit nuance. The battle continued for another hour. Kerrigan orbited overhead, a guardian angel made of titanium and high explosives. She made 3 more gun runs, expending most of her ammunition on targets that Gunslinger 6 identified. mortar positions, sniper hides, a building the Taliban were using as a command post. Each time she rolled in, fired, and pulled away. Each time the ground erupted beneath her. The American forces began to move. She watched them on the targeting pod, small figures in digital camouflage advancing through the village. They moved in teams, covering each other, clearing buildings. It was slow, methodical work. The kind of work that got people killed if they rushed. But they had air support now. They had an A-10 overhead that could put steel on target in seconds. That changed the equation. By 9:30, the firefight had ended. The Taliban fighters melted back into the mountains the way they always did, fatting into terrain that had hidden warriors for thousands of years. The Americans secured the village and began treating their wounded. Medevac helicopters were inbound, 20 minutes out. Hog 2-1, Gunslinger 6. We're good here, you're cleared off target, and 2-1, thank you, you kept us alive today. Kerrigan felt the weight of those words settle into her chest. She had heard them before on other missions in other wars. They never got easier. Just doing the job, 6. Get your people home. She turned the A-10 southwest toward Bagram. The aircraft felt lighter now, unburdened by most of its ordnance. Only a few hundred rounds remained in the gun. The Mavericks were gone. She had maybe 30 minutes of fuel left, enough to make it back with reserves. The flight home was quiet. She climbed to 12,000 feet and engaged the autopilot, letting the aircraft fly itself while she completed the post-mission checklist. Her hands moved automatically. Systems checks, fuel calculations, damage assessment, none this time. She had been lucky. Below her, the mountains gave way to foothills, then desert. The world looked clean from this altitude, scrubbed of details. No bodies, no blood. No smoke rising from destroyed vehicles, just earth and sky the way it had been before humans decided to ruin it. Bagram Tower cleared her for landing at 10:15. She descended through the pattern, lowering the landing gear at the appropriate altitude, configuring the aircraft for approach. The runway appeared ahead, shimmering in the heat. She touched down smooth, the main gear kissing the concrete with barely a chirp. The A-10 rolled out, slowing, obeying her hands. Lopez was waiting when she taxied to the hardstand. The crew chief directed her into position with hand signals, then gave the signal to cut engines. Kerrigan secured the systems and shut down. The turbines wound down, their sound fading from a roar to a whisper to nothing. She sat in the cockpit for a moment after everything was silent. Her hands were steady on her lap. Her breathing was controlled, but something in her chest felt tight, a knot she could not name and did not want to examine. She had done this hundreds of times. It should have felt routine by now. But it never did. She climbed down the ladder. Lopez was there with water and a clipboard. "How was it, ma'am?" "Same as always." "Squadron commander wants to see you. Said it's important." Kerrigan took the water and drank half the bottle in one pull. The heat was already oppressive, even at this hour. By afternoon, the ramp would be hot enough to cook on. Did he say why? "No, ma'am, but he didn't look happy." That tracked. Command was never happy. Happy meant everything was going according to plan, and nothing ever went according to plan. She headed toward the squadron building, still wearing her flight gear, sweat soaking through her flight suit. The ready room was empty except for two pilots sprawled on couches, playing video games on a screen someone had mounted to the wall. They looked up when she entered, then quickly looked away. The younger one, a first lieutenant named Garrett who had maybe 200 flight hours total, muttered something under his breath. Kerrigan ignored him. She had learned long ago that arguing with people who had already made up their minds was pointless. She knocked on the squadron commander's door and entered when he called for her. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Reeves sat behind a desk covered in paperwork and coffee stains. He was 47, a career officer who had flown F-16s before transitioning to the A-10. He had the look of someone who had aged faster than his years, stress carving lines into his face that no amount of sleep could erase. "Captain Kerrigan, sit." She sat. The chair creaked under her weight. The office smelled like old coffee and stale air conditioning. Reeves studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he slid a folder across the desk. "You did good work today. Gunslinger 6 sent a glowing report. Said you saved his platoon." "Just following orders, sir." "Don't be modest, Nora. Modesty is for people who haven't earned the right to be proud." He tapped the folder. "This is why I called you in. We've got a situation developing. Intel suggests the Taliban are planning something big. Multiple sources, all pointing to coordinated attacks across Kunar province. They want to make a statement before winter sets in." Kerrigan opened the folder. Inside were satellite photos, radio intercepts, and analysis from intelligence officers whose names were redacted. The pictures showed troop movements, supply caches, defensive positions. It looked like the Taliban were preparing for a siege. "Where?" she asked. "Multiple targets, but the primary concern is Firebase Phoenix. It's a small outpost up near the Pakistan border, 30 soldiers, mostly logistics and support. They're supposed to be monitoring border crossings, but they've been cut off for 3 days. Weather's keeping the helicopters grounded. Roads are mined. They're on their own until we can break through." Kerrigan looked at the map. Firebase Phoenix sat at the end of a narrow valley, surrounded by peaks that climbed over 14,000 feet. There was exactly one road in, and it wound through terrain perfect for ambushes. If the Taliban wanted to overrun a position, this was the one to hit. "You're sending me in," she said. Reeves nodded. "You and 3 others, formation flight, heavy ordnance. We need to show the Taliban that Firebase Phoenix is untouchable, make them think twice about an assault." "When?" "Tomorrow, dawn launch. You'll be the flight lead." She left the commander's office with the mission folder under her arm. Flight lead. That meant responsibility for 4 aircraft, 16 lives counting the pilots. It meant making decisions in real time while people shot at her. It meant that if something went wrong, it was her fault. The other pilots were still in the ready room when she walked through. Garrett looked up from his game. "Hey, Relic, heard you got a kill today. Congrats on finally doing your job." His partner, a captain named Deshaun Morris, elbowed him. "Shut up, man." But Garrett was young and stupid and convinced of his own invincibility. "What? I'm just saying, it's about time. Maybe if she flew faster missions instead of sightseeing, we wouldn't need to cover for her all the time." Kerrigan stopped. She turned slowly, her eyes locking onto Garrett's. The room went quiet. Even the video game music seemed to fade into the background. "Lieutenant," she said, her voice flat and cold, "how many combat missions have you flown?" He shifted in his seat. 12. "How many troops in contact?" 3. "How many times have you put ordnance danger close to friendlies?" "Once." Kerrigan stepped closer. She was not a tall woman, maybe 5'7", but something in her presence made Garrett shrink back into the couch. "I've flown 243 combat missions. I've engaged enemy forces 67 times. I've dropped ordnance danger close 81 times, and I've never, not once, hit a friendly position. When you can say the same, you can talk to me about doing my job. Until then, shut your mouth and learn something." She walked out before he could reply. Behind her, Morris was laughing. "Dude, she just destroyed you." Garrett's response was lost as the door swung shut. Kerrigan headed for her quarters, a small plywood box with a cot and a wall locker. The air conditioning barely worked. The walls were thin enough to hear conversations from neighboring rooms, but it was private, and privacy was a luxury in a war zone. She sat on the cot and opened the mission folder, studied the maps, memorized the terrain. Firebase Phoenix sat at grid coordinates that made her stomach clench. The valley was a death trap. She spent the evening in the planning room with the other 3 pilots who would fly the mission. Morris was one of them, solid and dependable. The other two were captains she had flown with before, Kara Finch, calm and precise, and James Nakamura, aggressive but smart. They went over the route, the targets, the contingencies. They planned for surface-to-air missiles, for bad weather, for mechanical failures. They planned for everything except the one variable that mattered most: luck. By midnight, they were as ready as they would ever be. Kerrigan dismissed the others and stayed behind, staring at the maps. Firebase Phoenix was a dot on a piece of paper, 30 soldiers who were counting on her to keep them alive. She thought about Gashta, about the platoon pinned down in the riverbed, about the lieutenant who had thanked her over the radio, his voice cracking with relief. She thought about all the times she had been thanked, all the missions that had ended with someone's life saved because she had been overhead. And she thought about the missions that had gone wrong, the ones where she had arrived too late, where the ordnance had hit 30 meters left of target, where soldiers had died because she had hesitated for 2 seconds trying to identify a target. Those were the ones that stayed with her. The successful missions faded. The failures carved themselves into memory like scars. She left the planning room and walked outside. The base was quiet at this hour, just the hum of generators and the distant sound of a helicopter landing on the medical pad. The sky was clear, stars scattered across blackness like thrown diamonds. She stood on the flight line and looked at the A-10s parked in their revetments. Ugly, graceless machines built for a war that never happened, now fighting a different war in mountains their designers had never imagined. Someone had once asked her why she kept flying. It was after her second deployment, after she had seen enough to know better. She had not had a good answer then. She still did not. But standing there under the stars, surrounded by aircraft that smelled like fuel and oil and violence, she understood something fundamental. This was the only thing she knew how to do. This was the only place she made sense. She went back to her quarters and lay down without undressing. Sleep came in fragments, broken by dreams of smoke and falling. The alarm went off at 4:30. She woke instantly, years of training overriding the need for gradual consciousness. She dressed in the dark, pulling on the flight suit that smelled like yesterday's sweat. Her hands moved through the routine automatically. Boots laced, survival vest buckled, pistol holstered. She checked her pockets, gloves, knee board, pen, energy bars she would not eat. The ready room was already occupied when she arrived. Morris, Finch, and Nakamura were drinking coffee and reviewing their notes. They looked up when she entered, and something passed between them. A nod, an acknowledgement, the understanding that they were about to fly into something dangerous and that they trusted each other to come back. The brief was short, weather was clear. Intel had nothing new. Firebase Phoenix had reported movement in the surrounding hills overnight but no direct contact. Yet, the word hung in the air, unspoken but understood. They walked to the flight line as a group. 4 pilots, 4 aircraft, 1 mission. The A-10 sat waiting, armed and fueled. Kerrigan's was tail number 417, an airframe with over 8,000 flight hours. It had been shot twice, once in Iraq by an Iraqi army soldier who did not get the memo about the ceasefire, and once in Afghanistan by a Taliban fighter who got lucky with an RPG that passed through the tail section without detonating. The aircraft had brought its pilot home both times. Lopez was waiting. She handed Kerrigan the maintenance log. "All systems green, ma'am. She's ready to fight." "She always is." Kerrigan climbed into the cockpit and began the startup sequence. Around her, the other 3 pilots were doing the same. Engines started, one after another, a symphony of turbine whine that echoed across the flight line. She watched the gauges come alive, needles swinging into green arcs. Everything looked good. Tower cleared them for taxi at 5:12. They moved as a formation, following the taxiway in single file. Kerrigan was lead, so she was first to reach the runway threshold. She checked her instruments one final time, then keyed the radio. "Hog flight check-in. 2, 3, 4. All present, all ready." She looked down the runway, 2 miles of concrete disappearing into the dawn haze. Somewhere beyond those mountains, soldiers were waking up and wondering if today was the day the Taliban came for them. Tower Hog Flight is ready for takeoff. Hog Flight cleared for takeoff. Winds 275 at 8 knots. Altimeter 3011. Kerrigan released the brakes and pushed the throttles forward. The A-10 began its slow acceleration, sluggish under the weight of full ordnance. She felt the vibration through the airframe, the engine straining. 100 knots. 120. She pulled back and the aircraft lifted off, climbing away from Bagram with Finch, Morris, and Nakamura following at 30-second intervals. They formed up at 5,000 feet, a loose tactical formation with Kerrigan in the lead and the others staggered behind and to her flanks. The flight to Firebase Phoenix would take 45 minutes, following a route that kept them away from known anti-aircraft positions. They flew northeast, paralleling the border, climbing to 15,000 feet to clear the peaks. The sun rose behind them, painting the mountains gold and red. From this altitude, the world looked like something from a painting, unreal, untouched. But Kerrigan knew better. Every valley down there held the potential for violence. Every ridgeline could hide a fighter with a missile launcher. The beauty was a lie. The radio crackled. Hog Flight, this is Longbow. We're picking up increased radio chatter in your area of operations. Recommend heightened alert. Longbow was the AWACS aircraft orbiting somewhere over Pakistan, its radar watching everything within 200 miles. If they were hearing chatter, it meant the enemy was coordinating, planning, getting ready to do something stupid. Hog copies, Kerrigan replied. She switched to the internal frequency. Hog Flight, stay sharp, we're flying into something. 3 acknowledgments came back. She scanned the horizon, looking for contrails or glints of reflected light. Nothing, just sky and mountains and the promise of violence. They crossed into the target area at 5:57. Firebase Phoenix was visible on the targeting display, a cluster of fortifications on a hilltop surrounded by wire and sandbags. It looked tiny and fragile, a sandcastle waiting for the tide. Firebase Phoenix, Hog Flight checking in. 4 A-10s with mixed ordnance, playtime 3 hours. The voice that answered was young and tired. Hog Flight Phoenix Actual, thank God you're here. We've got movement all around us. They're massing for an assault. Kerrigan pushed the throttle forward, accelerating toward the firebase. She descended to 8,000 feet and began a wide orbit, scanning the terrain. The targeting pod showed heat signatures everywhere. 50, 100, more. They were in the trees, behind rocks, in abandoned buildings. The Taliban had brought an army. Phoenix Actual, Hog Lead. I'm seeing a lot of personnel in the open. Need you to confirm hostile. Hog, they're all hostile. We've been taking sporadic fire all night. They're just waiting for the right moment to hit us. Kerrigan's jaw tightened. This was not a skirmish. This was a full-scale assault waiting to happen. The Taliban had committed resources, brought in fighters from across the region. They intended to make an example of Firebase Phoenix, to show that even American positions could be overrun. She would not let that happen. Hog Flight split up. 2 take the northern approach, 3 east, 4 south. I've got west. We're going to orbit this firebase and make ourselves a problem for anyone with bad intentions. The flights separated, each aircraft moving to its assigned sector. Kerrigan focused on the western valley, the most likely avenue of approach for a ground assault. Her targeting pod showed dozens of fighters moving through the tree line, advancing in groups, using cover. They were disciplined, well-trained, not the usual Taliban rabble. Phoenix Actual,